This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Oh, I say, it's all over.
If Roger Federer was keen to win back your support, he would need to go naked in Say Grazia magazine.
No, I'm only joking. I'm only joking.
Listen, it's a reason.
Yes.
As Wimbledon ends, 5 Live presenter Richard Bacon is sent back to the studio, much to the relief of some feedback listeners. And is this over as well?
Let's go!
So, how did it go?
All right, I suppose. There was some database stuff that I wasn't sure about, but, well, it's over now.
The somewhat controversial first series of Ambridge Extra ends. Will there be a second? And we've heard it before, but this time it looks as if it really could happen. The end of massive paychecks for senior BBC executives. We'll hear more from the chairman of the BBC Trust, Chris Slasher Patton, in a few moments. In pursuit of journalistic transparency and in the interest of dispelling the black arts, Ian Mackenzie tweeted to say, "Here's an idea. Why don't media organisations film their editorial conferences and publish them?" Well, the BBC has never allowed a fly-on-the-wall series to be made about its management or governance. But would Radio 4's new programme, Leader Conference, fit the bill? On Wednesday, the Observer's Andrew Rawnsley chaired a live debate with fellow journalists in the style of a newspaper leader conference to establish what points those editorials ought to make and why.
Try and do a tweak. Ross said that it should be about phone hacking at the News of the World, but obviously we wrote about that yesterday.
Ronald Monroe from the Isle of Man thought it was informative and interesting. Susanna Beatson-Hurd of Chepstow, however, thought it was incoherent and inarticulate. Less is more for Susanna, but for Peter Hartley, more would have been preferable. He was listening to Sheila Fogarty and John Pienaar's 5 Live coverage of the phone hacking scandal during Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday.
I was a bit disappointed that Radio 5 didn't run this in full. Although John Pienaar was in the studio and gave an excellent report of what people said, what you lost from not listening to the full debate was the nuances and the atmosphere.
We put Peter's points to 5 Live, who had this to say.
We recognised that the debate was an important parliamentary moment, which was why we covered the start of it live and then dipped in and out. Frequent updates from John Pienaar ensured that listeners were aware of all the key contributions. We don't generally take Commons debates live for 3 hours because we want to offer reporting and analysis around such events, as well as cover other news.
Now, our starter for 10. Where in the world is this?
And Barbara Windsor is just sitting down again. Hello again, Barbara Windsor.
Hello. Had to go to you-know-where.
Yes, I understand,
But I know.
Worry.
It's all turned around, isn't it?
Isn't it? We were
Yes.
just saying that.
You go to the loo, and look what happens.
Miranda Hart, your thoughts?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm a little bit down now.
Yeah.
It's disappointing, isn't it?
Sally Dinover joins me now in our commentary box. Sally Webster in Coronation Street. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Richard.
You've been here before?
Never.
What do you
and I
make
am
of it?
So exciting.
Ascot, the Royal Wedding, Appleby Horse Fair. No, London SW19, where everybody, but everybody, darling, just had to be seen during Wimbledon fortnight. P. Middy was there, of course. That's Pippa Middleton to you and me, as well as Sir Brucey and the Governor of the Bank of England, who seemed to be in the royal box every day of the final week. Was 5 Live more interested in what was going on off the court rather than what was on it? That's what some feedback listeners think.
Serving at the Royal Box End in front of the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Governor of the Bank of England, and a backhand return.
The BBC has already apologised this week for the annoying commentary and admitted that over-talking can irritate our audience. Most complaints were about the television coverage, but some of you reckon that radio was just as bad. David Winter was so disenchanted with Richard Bacon's celeb spotting at Wimbledon that he switched off, and he wasn't alone.
My name is Rob Simmons. I live in Finstock in Oxfordshire. When you're listening to the radio, the sound is all you've got. But Radio 5 Live seem to be more concerned about talking about the celebrities in the royal box or what they did last night or what they're going to do tonight. And the lead man, who I believe was Richard Bacon, really does seem to have a thing about celebrities rather than the event. It's all trivia.
Rob Simmons. On the other hand, 5 Live's commentary of the long-awaited World Heavyweight Unification fight last Saturday between Britain's WBA champion David Haye and the Ukrainian Vladimir Klitschko was considered a knockout, something Mr. Haye couldn't manage. Pickle, on the 5 Live blog, said, "This genuinely is the only thing I always listen to rather than pay to watch. It really is better on the radio." Well, on 5 Live perhaps, but not apparently on Radio 4. Many of you got in touch earlier this week after hearing Gary Richardson's interview with David Hay after he'd lost the match, which took place not long after he'd broken his little toe. Some of you felt Gary's punches were below the belt.
Because initially I know you said the toe was a problem and that's why you lost, but you sort of retract that.
I didn't say it's why I lost.
My name's Bev Bruce and I live in the Yorkshire Dales. The interviewer persisted in trying to pin him in a corner to say that this was just the excuse he was using for losing the fight. He then persevered down another route of being facetious in the extreme.
The fact that you couldn't stand on your right foot, though, in hindsight...
I could stand on it, but I was unable to sort of explode off of it like I usually do.
Given that you were unable to explode off of it, then, do you wish in...
And I just felt that the interviewer had no interest whatsoever in listening to David Hayes. It was almost as though he was trying to get a first exclusive on David's resignation from the ring.
Lost loads of money. You wouldn't have messed a lot of people around. You'd have lost your purse, wouldn't you?
I would have, in fact, probably got...
Oh, hello. I've just been listening to your sports reporter. I thought he was unnecessarily rude. That's just a comment I wanted to make. Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, Gary isn't around this week, and no one else is available. But his employer, the Today programme, sent us this statement.
Like any experienced journalist, Gary was attempting to get to the heart of the story and chose to take a robust approach. While some listeners may feel this tactic was heavy-handed and more suited to other Today guests, Gary was trying to gain a straight answer for boxing fans who felt they had wasted their money, as Hay had admitted he wasn't fully fit for the fight.
There will be more unrest at the Today programme and elsewhere if proposed strikes across the BBC go ahead later this month over plans to cut jobs. But savings have to be made somewhere, and by someone. The BBC's spending is to be cut by 20% as a result of the recent licence fee settlement. Lord Patten, who turned down the chance to join the BBC as a young graduate 44 years ago, is now the chairman of the BBC Trust. His dry wit and sophisticated speech conceals arguably a more effective fighter than fellow heavyweight David Hay. And as you may have heard, he's planning to save the corporation millions by cutting the pay of senior staff and scrapping some of their perks. Lord Patten went into more detail about his plans at his first public lecture for the Royal Television Society earlier this week. And here's how he plans to curb excessive pay, which he describes as one of the most toxic reasons for the public's lack of sympathy for the BBC.
Licence fee payers don't expect the BBC to pay sky-high commercial rewards to people that work for a public service. They do expect the BBC to deliver the highest quality programmes and services. The challenge is to balance these demands in the right way. The freeze on bonuses for the most senior executives will continue. No executive board member will get a bonus in future. The public service BBC needs to distance itself in this way from the market. And private health insurance will be phased out for senior managers. Senior staff shouldn't have those sort of benefits if they're not available to everyone in the organisation.
But while reining in executive pay and cutting the number of senior managers are priorities for Lord Patten, he's proposing to create a new senior post to help streamline the BBC complaints process, which came in for criticism in a report from the House of Lords Communications Committee last week.
To help deal with the particular complexities of the complaints system, a new position of Chief Complaints Editor will be appointed, reporting direct to the Director-General. That person's job will be to make the internal systems as fast and effective as possible. I hope that will mean issuing a clear and early apology if that's what needs to happen.
Lord Patten also suggested that profits from BBC Worldwide, that's the BBC's commercial arm, could in future be used to further subsidise the BBC's public service content, including the World Service. Chris Patten looks like becoming a very active chairman of the BBC Trust. Now, I don't think the new chief complaints editor will want to get involved in arguments about the weather forecasts, but lots of feedback listeners got in touch after my visit to the BBC Weather Centre last week, where I raised some of your concerns about the forecasts broadcast on radio. Some of you wondered if the language weather presenters use is getting a bit too, well, flowery. Feedback listener Sarianne Jury disagrees. She thinks that weather words should be more poetic, not less.
Dear Richard Bolton.
Oh,
bother. I better do that correctly.
Please do.
Dear Roger Bolton, I was listening to the weather forecast and I heard the forecaster personalise the weather, and he said, the front is trying to push its way inland. After hearing that, I wrote the following poem. Over the North Sea lies the front, elbows on the black isobar, chevrons to the side. Arms stretch far sideways to gather strength. The push starts, bringing cloud and damp. Showers will drop onto morning ground. Overnight frost will be softened. Moving further, it will travel south, letting small patches of sunlight through behind. Gusty winds are caught up with it. They will pick up dropped paper, dust, detritus, whip them round in front of tall grey buildings. The inked black lines of the front may be visible as they climb through and over cities and towns. Leaves will be snatched from trees.
Sarianne Jury. Paul Rowan from Newcastle sympathises with those who aren't sure where they live, north, south, east or west, when forecasters divide up the country. Paul says he's inspired by the shipping forecast, but I think he must have been listening to the food programme when he came up with this suggestion that forecasters should define each region by its cuisine. His forecast is read by Radio 4 announcer Jim Lee.
Haggis, Saveloy, Vindaloo. Cool and cloudy, rain later. Pie, chips, jellied eels. Hot and sunny, cloudy later. Stew, pasties, Guinness. Hot, sunny and fine later.
Other regional stereotypes are available. Now, do you know how many and what sort of people listen to feedback? RAJAR knows. It stands for Radio Joint Audience Research Limited and is jointly owned by the BBC and its commercial rivals. Every year, 100,000 RAJAR surveys are completed, detailing what people are listening to and when. Up to now, they've kept paper diaries, but this month, listeners are able to switch to filling in their diaries online, if they want to. RAJAR's figures would have helped the BBC make its recent decision to move many of its children's programmes off the radio onto online, because, as they said, not enough young people were tuning into the broadcasts. Maddie Fingers thinks the figures could be open to misinterpretation.
It seems to me that the BBC bases their programming either rearranging or putting out what they think we want to hear based on the figures that come out of that system. And it seems to be something that they defend themselves with against any arguments of unrest or disturbance among the loyal listening public who actually love their programmes and complain the minute anything's changed. So anything that can go towards making the system more sophisticated has got to be a good thing, and it's not before time.
But Russ Elliott is sceptical.
I can't see that the online diary system making that much difference to the accuracy of the figures, because it still relies on people trying to remember what they listen to or think they've listened to. And there's a danger that people who do start using the online diary system could confuse their live and their time-shifted catch-up listening. The RAJARs are supposed to record only the live listening figures, of course. Incidentally, have you actually found anyone who does a RAJAR diary? I've never heard anyone who's admitted to it.
Neither have I. So I went to the headquarters of RAJAR to find out for myself. Jerry Hill is the head of the organisation, and I asked him how the data is collected at the moment.
We've got 2,000 diaries placed each week through the course of the year. So across the whole year, that adds up to about 100,000 diaries that we've actually placed and are able to use as part of the survey. So it is probably one of the biggest media surveys in Europe, actually, as opposed to the UK.
So if the present system works well, why are you taking it online?
What we had identified quite some time ago now was that the marketplace was essentially moving very much toward a situation where people were becoming much more available to broadband. Broadband penetration now is somewhere in the order of excess of 70%. We're asking for exactly the same information, but what we're giving people is a choice as to how they essentially respond to us.
Do you think that online will be more accurate then?
I think the two things that we've learnt. Firstly, when we went out to do some of our preliminary research, what we identified was that out of people asked whether they would like to return the existing paper diary or whether they would like to participate using the online return, 50% of the audience were interested in online. So it was something that we couldn't ignore. In terms of accuracy, what's interesting is that by removing a number of what we describe as the sort of manual operational processes, there will be some enhancements in the general accuracy. The user experience testing that we've seen does demonstrate that as people go through the online diary, they are attributing certain aspects of their listening at a slightly sharper level than we found on the paper diary.
But you're not going to eliminate the paper diaries, are you? Because otherwise you'd be eliminating still a significant proportion of the audience.
Absolutely right. We don't have any intention of removing paper. There will be people that don't want to respond online.
But why did you have digital wristwatch recorders? Because that's done for television. Does that mean that radio has got in effect less money to play with than television? That television can afford to have the best, radio perhaps the second best in this case?
No, I mean, the economics are that television is a far bigger business, and the television viewing and the way people watch television is far easier to be able to record their viewing through technology. With radio, people are on the go, they're moving from room to room, and what we found was that people were not wishing to carry another device around the home. The existing survey is delivering very consistent levels of information that come back, and as an audience research method, it sets an incredibly high standard.
Jerry Hill, Chief Executive of Radio Joint Audience Research. So how useful is all this information to the BBC? Alison Winter leads a team of 8 audience researchers at the BBC's Audio and Music Department, and I asked her what role the radar data plays in her work.
It's absolutely critical to everything that I do. Radar data, beyond telling us a headline figure about how many people are listening to a particular show, will also tell us a lot more information about not just age, but gender, geographical location of those people as well.
But how reliable is it? Other people spin it, don't they? Anybody who's read the inside story of Radio 1 when it was particularly unpopular after a number of changes a good few years ago, know that having received the research, there were agitated conversations about what people could possibly say that was positive.
It's always possible with research to pick and choose, to put a different spin on it.
It's a PR business as well. Even the BBC, not you, but the BBC press departments and so on, they're all involved in a bit of spin, aren't they? They're trying
There is, absolutely, and it's my job, and that of Radar actually, to give a firm slap on the wrist to anyone who misuses the data. A stern email at the beginning.
You have sent some?
I have.
You'd like to tell us when?
Absolutely not.
Thought not. Right. Can we ask a question here that Russ Elliott wants me to put? He said, I can't see that the online diary system is going to make that much difference to the accuracy of the figures because it still relies on people trying to remember what they listen to or think they listen to. Do you acknowledge those dangers?
Actually, Radar is not a recall survey. It's a pre-call survey. If I ask you how many post boxes you just passed on your way in to see me today, you could give me a guess, but it probably wouldn't be very accurate.
It would not be accurate at all. I wouldn't even have noticed with my head in the air.
Absolutely. If I now say to you, on your way out from seeing me to wherever you're going next, can you count how many post boxes you see? Your answer's going to be that much more accurate.
But Russ Elliott's got another point about time-shifted figures. By the way, what are time-shifted figures?
Time-shifted figures relate to any point at which an audience member is listening to non-live radio, so that could be catch-up via the BBC Radio iPlayer, or it could be downloads or podcasts, for instance.
Well, what Russ Elliott thinks is that that's probably the biggest hole in the current radar system, is the lack of the inclusion of those time-shifted figures, which he says are now becoming increasingly significant, are they?
They are becoming more significant, but still not to a level where we think the time is right for them to be included on the Radar survey. If we take an example, which your listeners will probably be familiar with, which is the podcast, or download, I should say, of A History of the World in 100 Objects, We got up to sort of in the region of 18 million UK downloads for that. Huge.
Sorry, 18 million?
18 million. If you put that into the context of what Radar tells us happens live every week, which is 1 billion live hours listened every week, we see that actually time-shifted listening is still a tiny proportion, and our own research suggests it's less than 1% of listening every week. We are monitoring that in the BBC and through a bespoke survey that Radar runs on an ongoing basis. When we think the time is right, and it is of such magnitude, we will explore ways to introduce that onto the main survey.
Could I ask you about the digital uptake? Where is it at the moment?
It's been on an upward trend since 2007 when Radar started to measure it. It's stalled of late. Currently, we're at 43% of the population listening digitally every week, and just over a quarter of all hours listened are digital. But we can again use Radar data to look under the surface of that, and we find some really interesting underlying trends. We find that DAB as a platform is relatively more important for older people. But I think we're seeing all signs going in the right direction, and innovations like Radio Player, for instance, where you can listen to BBC and commercial radio stations online, are all designed to help people find digital.
Now, at the moment, the BBC is, I'm tempted to say, convulsed. That's perhaps a little harsh, but certainly very much preoccupied with DQF, Delivering Quality First, which is the title given to this survey where they're trying to find 20% savings and so on. How much is audience research informing those decisions?
It is, in as much as Radar data is often the bedrock from which you start to look at any discussions around editorial changes or strategic changes. So my team has been incredibly busy over the last few months. We've been feeding in Radar analysis and other data that we have at our disposal to help guide any decisions around proposals that are audience-facing.
And Alison, I couldn't let this interview go by without a purely self-indulgent couple of questions. First of all, how many people listen to feedback each week?
In an average week, 1.4 million adults listen to feedback every week. And I should say as well that feedback listeners are more likely than the average person in the population to have multiple radio sets at home, which suggests perhaps they maybe want feedback to accompany them everywhere they go in their house.
That just shows they're so well informed about radio and so intelligent. Thanks very much. Alison Winter. She knows if you're listening, so you better had. Whether you're tuning in or downloading, we'd love to hear your thoughts about what you're listening to.
You can write to Feedback, PO Box 67234, London SE1P 4AX, or leave a phone message on 03 333 444 544. Standard line charges apply, but it could cost more on some mobile networks. Or you can email feedback@bbc.co.uk. All those details are on our website.
Thanks, Jim. According to Radar, around 40% of listeners listen to digital broadcasts. Russell Buckley is one of them, but he's finding it a bit frustrating.
As a very regular listener of the Archers podcast, every episode now concludes with the invitation to leave my memories of the programme at bbc.co.uk/Archers. There doesn't appear to be such a facility at the website. It gets very irritating being repeated after every episode. It gets very irritating being repeated after every episode. It gets very irritating being repeated after every episode. Great programme, though.
Well, we asked the Archers team what was going on, and it seems they added this call to arms to mark the programme's 60th anniversary earlier in January, and then forgot to take it off. They have now. I'm sure the hip kids in Ambridge Extra would have been more switched on. Some of you were sceptical about how successful this new offshoot would be when it started back in April, but a number of you have been in touch this week to say how sad you are that the first series is already over, and hope there'll be a second.
My name is Ross Ashley, and I thought it was very good indeed. They sort of promised us a powerful ending to the series, and it really was very good, and I thought the actress that plays Alice Carter was absolutely exceptional in it.
I love you, Chris. And I love it here. This is where I belong.
I'm Paul Hopkins. I'm really sad that Ambridge Extra has ended. I enjoyed the series and found it excellent in both respect of a standalone series and how well it linked in with the main Archers storyline. I hope a second series is commissioned.
Well, the good news for Archers addicts is that it was always intended there would be at least 2 series, and the second one starts in the autumn. After that, who knows? Depends on Rajar's ratings, I guess.
The International Monetary Fund has today selected Christine Lagarde to serve as IMF Managing
Christine Lagarde
Director.
succeeded the disgraced, but perhaps not strictly guilty, Dominic Strauss-Kahn. Miss Lagarde is undoubtedly extremely elegant, but presumably it was her brain, not her clothes, that secured the IMF job. So why did this week's Profile programme on Radio 4 start off with this?
She's the first female to hold the position, and as she glides across the world stage in designer outfits...
Abigail Pitcher from Chiswick in West London. In the 21st century, I find this very sexist and irrelevant to why Christine Lagarde is in the position that she's in today.
Madame Lagarde is an elegant woman in a testosterone-fuelled man's world. Barbara Glass is a US fashion blogger.
She wears Hermes and Chanel.
Nicola Dempsey, I live in Ealing. I was incensed, to be honest. There was another description of her 5'10" tall with a mop of silver hair. I mean, what are we describing here? Are we talking about Jennifer Aniston or Helen Mirren? No, we're not. We're talking about a serious woman who's had a career in law, who has worked for her government and is now taking on a position that is really, with the financial crisis, is really important.
You're never quite sure what she's wearing. She is so self-assured and carries her...
My name's Catherine Jackson and I live near Lewes in East Sussex. Just as an exercise, would the BBC re-record the same profile, replacing she with he, just to demonstrate what it sounds like and how singularly inappropriate this profile was? I mean, I've made a start. An elegant man in an estrogen-fueled world, and as he glides across the stage in designer suits, we are unlikely to forget it. If you look at it that way, you really do have to question the whole focus of that profile.
So what could be the explanation for this seemingly anachronistic description of a powerful female politician? The editor of Profile sent us this statement.
It's always a judgment call about where to start, and we try to complement coverage elsewhere on the network rather than repeat it. Profile used a description of her striking and stylish presence to paint a picture for listeners who may not be familiar with the name. It's not often that the head of an international financial institution is written about in the fashion press, so commenting on her style felt both relevant and colourful. We'd have done the same had it been a man. The programme then quickly moved on to hear from two commentators about her ability, as a non-economist, to do the IMF job.
In a couple of weeks, you'll have the chance to put your questions to Gwyneth Williams, the stylish controller of Radio 4, last seen in a very fetching trouser suit with a scarlet pashmina tossed over her shoulder. She's now almost 1 year into the job, so feel free to start letting me know what you'd like me to ask her. Goodbye.
From not listening to the full debate was the nuances and the atmosphere.
We put Peter's points to 5 Live, who had this to say.
We recognised that the debate was an important parliamentary moment, which was why we covered the start of it live and then dipped in and out. Frequent updates from John Pienaar ensured that listeners were aware of all the key contributions. We don't generally take Commons debates live for 3 hours because we want to offer reporting and analysis around such events, as well as cover other news.
Well, Monroe from the Isle of Man thought it was informative and interesting. Susanna Beatson-Hurd of Chepstow, however, thought it was incoherent and inarticulate. Less is more for Susanna, but for Peter Hartley, more would have been preferable. He was listening to Sheila Fogarty and John Pienaar's 5 Live coverage of the phone hacking scandal during Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday.
I was a bit disappointed that Radio 5 didn't run this in full. Although John Pienaar was in the studio and gave an excellent report of what people said, what you lost...
This is a download from the BBC. To find out more and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk. Oh, I say, it's all over.
If Roger Federer was keen to win back your support, he would need to go naked in Say Grazia magazine.
No, I'm only joking. I'm only joking.
Listen, it's a reason.
Yes.
As Wimbledon ends, 5 Live presenter Richard Bacon is sent back to the studio, much to the relief of some feedback listeners. And is this over as well?
Let's go! So, how did it go?
All right, I suppose. There was some database stuff that I wasn't sure about, but, well, it's over now.
The somewhat controversial first series of Ambridge Extra ends. Will there be a second? And we've heard it before, but this time it looks as if it really could happen. The end of massive paychecks for senior BBC executives. We'll hear more from the chairman of the BBC Trust, Chris Slasher-Patton, in a few moments. In pursuit of journalistic transparency and in the interest of dispelling the black arts, Ian Mackenzie tweeted to say, "Here's an idea. Why don't media organisations film their editorial conferences and publish them?" Well, the BBC has never allowed a fly-on-the-wall series to be made about its management or governance. But would Radio 4's new programme, Leader Conference, fit the bill? On Wednesday, the Observer's Andrew Rawnsley chaired a live debate with fellow journalists in the style of a newspaper leader conference to establish what points those editorials ought to make and why.
Try and do a tweet. Ross said that it should be about phone hacking at the News of the World, but obviously we wrote about that yesterday. And